I mean, obviously there's something wrong with her. She couldn't even keep her relationship down. Had 5 husbands? Come on. What kind of woman are we dealing with here? Welcome back, guys. I'm Pastor Sean Finney, and this is Fed Up Church. Sick and tired and fed up of all the garbage that was coming out of pulpits, so we started this YouTube channel. I want to talk to you about something serious, and it's one of the most important chapters in the book of John. And I think it gets mispreached, misunderstood, and women get bashed over the head with this chapter for absolutely no reason, because pastors and preachers don't understand it. They don't take the time to study it, and that's their problem. But I want to dig into it, and I'll pick up in verse 1 in chapter 4 of John, and I'm going to read from the New International Version for the majority of this tonight, but I want you to see if you can notice a few key words as we go through here that stand out. At least they stood out to me, and we can really see the context of the story of the woman at the well. John chapter 4. Now, Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that he was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John, although in fact it was not Jesus who baptized, but his disciples. So he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now, verse 4 says he had to go through Samaria. He had to. He had to go through Samaria. Why? So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well, and it was about noon. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans." They don't associate with Samaritans? Like, why? What's the context there? What's the story there? This is what I had to dig into, because it bothered me. Why did the Jews not want anything to do with Samaritans? Because we know the Good Samaritan, right? Well, that takes on an entirely new context when you understand what Jesus was talking about. Verse 10, Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." "Sir," the woman said. I love that response. "Sir. Oh, sir." "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with, and this well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his livestock?" Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water that I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." You can hear the sarcasm like pouring out at this point from this woman. "Oh, yeah, oh, give me some of that." Verse 16. He told her, "Go, call your husband and come back." And this is where it kind of goes off the rails. She said, "I have no husband," she replied. Jesus said to her, "You are right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you've had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have just said is quite true." Ouch. And this is where we preach this wrong. In every context, I have seen this preached. It's wrong. And that's a bold statement. I understand that. But follow me here. Let's continue through. If you stick with me through this study, I think it'll completely change your life. It'll change your perspective on this chapter. One of the most important chapters in the book of John. Verse 19, she says, "Sir," the woman said, "I can see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." "Woman," Jesus replied, "believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know." Like, you don't have a clue what you worship. You don't know. "We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming, and has now come, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshippers the Father seeks. Keep that in mind. All you typical churchgoers, it's not about the building. It's about the Father seeks those who worship him in spirit and in truth, not in church, not in a building, but in spirit and in truth. Verse 24 says, God is spirit, and his worshippers must worship in the spirit and in truth. The woman said, I know that Messiah, called Christ, is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us. And this is like the greatest, like, this woman. Okay, this woman's brilliant, right? She not only is she like great at like sarcastically playing off what Jesus is saying, because she doesn't really recognize who he is. Like, nobody ever recognizes Jesus as Jesus when he shows up, if you notice that going through the New Testament. But it doesn't take long. But in this period where she's first meeting him, and when she starts to come to realization of who he is, she is responding like your average person would today, right? Like, yeah, okay, well, you guys say this, other people say that. Who knows what's true, you know? Someday God will show up and it'll explain it all to us. Like, but until then, let me draw my freaking water and shut up and leave me alone. Like, you shouldn't even be talking to me in the first place because I'm a Samaritan woman and you're a Jew male. You're a Jewish male. Like, we don't talk to each other to begin with. But certainly, certainly, a Jewish man would not be talking to a Samaritan woman. No, absolutely not. Verse 26, then Jesus declared, I, the one speaking to you, I am he, right? I am the Christ. I am the Messiah that you're talking about right now. Verse 27, just then his disciples returned. Oh, now they show up. They went on a lunch break. Now they come back at this moment. Just then his disciples returned and were surprised to find him talking with a woman. See, it doesn't say a Samaritan. It doesn't say that they were surprised he was talking to a Samaritan. They were talking to Samaritans, right? Because they had to go buy food. They were surprised to find Jesus talking to a woman. Remember the culture of the day. It was not equal rights. It wasn't a feminist movement. It was the complete polar opposite of that. Just then the disciples returned and were surprised to find him talking with a woman, but no one asked, what do you want? Or why are you talking with her? Did we ever stop to ask that question? Like, Jesus, what do you want? What do you want from me? What do you want? Or do we, just a side note, this is not what the message is about. But as a side note, when we pray, is it typically what we want? Or are we actually asking what God wants? What do you want, Jesus? They didn't even bother to ask. Nobody even asked why he was talking with her. They were just surprised that he was talking to a woman. Like, okay, this is new. Then, leaving her water jar, the woman went back to the town and said to the people, come, see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah? They came out of the town and made their way toward him. Meanwhile, his disciples urged him, Rabbi, eat something. But he said to them, I have food to eat that you know nothing about. Ouch. When Jesus looks at you and tells you, you know nothing about it. Facts. True. But ouch. Then the disciples said to each other, could someone have brought him food? They're oblivious. Like the average church is today. Verse 34, he says, my food, right? My food, said Jesus, is to do the will of him who sent me and finish his work. Don't you have a saying, it's still 4 months until harvest? I tell you, open your eyes and look at the fields. They are ripe for harvest. Even now, the one who reaps draws a wage and harvests a crop for eternal life, so that the sower and the reaper may be glad together. Thus the saying, one sows and another reaps, is true. I sent you to reap what you have not worked for. Others have done the hard work, and you have reaped the benefits of their labor. Many of the Samaritans from the town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I ever did. Well, he just said you have 5 husbands, and the man you're with now is not your husband. I'm sure that's not everything she's ever done, but to her it was everything. He spoke to her identity in that moment, and we're going to dig into this. So when the Samaritans came to him, they urged him to stay with them, and he stayed 2 days. And because of his words, many more became believers. They said to the woman, "We no longer believe just because of what you said. Now we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this man really is the Savior of the world." I want to dig into the application, the misconceptions, and our understanding of this Samaritan woman at the well. Because it is a very common passage that pretty much every preacher that I've ever heard at some point they preach on the woman at the well, which tells you how iconic it is. But I think for the wrong reasons. And this is what nobody talks about. So I need to tease out some answers from this passage, right? In order to understand it, I need to dig in and understand to answer the questions, why did Jesus have to go through Samaria? It says he had to. He didn't have to, right? Because, the Jews rarely ever did. But it said Jesus had to go through Samaria. Why? Why did Jesus go alone? He sent the disciples off to get food, and he went into this encounter alone. Something that would definitely have been frowned upon by the pious Jews of the day. A man speaking to a woman alone. No. Why did Jesus violate all the protocols of the day in speaking to a woman anyway? Especially one that's non-Jewish. That breaks all the societal constructs of his day. Breaks them, shatters them, barrels right through them. And why did Jesus make this awkward, abrupt turn in the conversation to her marital status? So that begs the question, what kind of woman was this? I've heard it preached countless times. And they all kind of gather around a common theme. They all carry a common thread. And it's that Jesus had to go through Samaria because there was this immoral woman living some kind of wicked lifestyle, just full of sin, and he had to go and save her. Yeah, but Jesus saved everyone by what he did on the cross. So you can't say that it was, just for the Samaritan woman because of the lifestyle she was living. Because Jesus doesn't show up to everybody in Samaria individually. We have to remember, this is the longest dialogue recorded in the New Testament between Jesus and any other individual, period. This is why it makes it one of the most important chapters in the book of John. And although I do believe there's some truth in the fact that, okay, she had issues that she was dealing with, and Jesus went to help her. I believe that's true. But I believe it's an overly simplistic take on one of the most important passages in the Bible. And that's a bold claim. I get it. I know. I completely understand. But follow me. I think it's important to understand this chapter in the context of this chapter for a few different reasons. There was a 5-year project that was headed by the Barna Group, and they explored the opportunities and the challenges of faith development among teens and young adults within this rapidly shifting and adjusting culture of ours. The project was comprised of 8 national studies, including interviews with teenagers, interviews with young adults, parents, youth pastors, and senior pastors. The focus? Explore the reason why nearly 3 out of every 5 Christians, 59%, disconnect either permanently or for an extended period of time from church life after the age of 15. Reasons varied, of course, but what they did find was revealing. The first reason they found is that 23% said that Christianity feels too stifling. It's too fear-based. It's too risk-averse. For example, 1/4 of the 18 to 29-year-olds said that Christians demonize everything outside of the church. Yeah, isn't that the truth? Other perceptions were that churches ignore the problems of the real world. 22% of the group said that. The second reason that young adults leave church altogether is something that they feel is lacking in their experience at church. A third of them said, 31%, said, church is boring. Well, they're not wrong. In a lot of cases, it is. Personally, I believe we do a great disservice to all believers if, whether you've been in church for 50 years or 50 minutes, if we take a shallow approach to such a deep discussion. And I've heard it before, keep it simple, just keep it simple. You don't want to throw too much at them. No. 1 Corinthians 2:10 says, these are the things God has revealed to us by his Spirit. The Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God. And if the things of God are deep, shouldn't we at least dig in deep and try to understand what God is trying to teach us? Not keep it simple, not intentionally try to oversimplify everything and sugarcoat it and make it in little bite-sized portions so that everybody can just get just enough to taste it, but not enough to be satisfied. That is what frustrates me the most with church. That's what I got fed up with. I got sick and tired of it, is the cliches and the garbage and the lacking of any kind of substance on everything coming out of a church. We need to do better. We need to teach it truer, deeper, more real. Otherwise, it is boring. And we end up demonizing everything outside of the church, thinking the church is some kind of freaking brick building. The church is a body of believers. You are the church, not the building. So let's talk about some commonly held beliefs about this passage. We believe that this woman is low class, uneducated, and of bad rapport, right? Bad reputation. She's had 5 husbands, and apparently she's currently having an affair now. That's the assumption. She is so ashamed, so embarrassed, so disgraced that she can't show her face around the well when normal people go to the well in the morning when it's cooler. She goes in the middle of the freaking day when it's hot because she's embarrassed. The entire point of this story is about her being that kind of woman. It's my personal opinion, and I will say it that way. It is my personal opinion that all 3 of those claims are blatantly false. Fraudulent, made up garbage spewed from a pulpit to try to conform a group of people to rules and regulations that Jesus didn't put on them. It's the Pharisees gone wild again. And if I were to teach such a shallow view of it, I believe that I would be held accountable by God according to James 3:1. I'm not going to do that. So let's get some context. These disciples obviously had no interest in going through Samaria. To the Jews, it was a place to be avoided. To the Jews, it was a people to be despised and hated. Verse 9 clearly tells us the Jews had nothing to do with the Samaritans. But why? For this, you have to understand the history between these 2 groups of people. So when the Babylonians had conquered the southern kingdom of Judah, they took almost, smacking my mic. They took almost all of the population captive. Almost. Exiling them to the Babylonian Empire. All they left behind were the lowest classes of society. Because they didn't want these lowly regarded people in Babylonia. They thought they were uneducated. Basically, they left the hicks there, right? The people who had nothing to do, and I can say that. Hick myself. But they left, basically, if you were uneducated, they didn't think you had any value to add to the empire. They left you behind. You weren't even considered fortunate enough to be captured. Leave them there. So the ones that were left behind, they eventually have children, right, of their own, and they go on and they intermarry with these other groups that were kind of moving into the region in the absence of the Israelites. So you end up with non-Jewish people marrying previously Jewish people, just the lowest of the Jewish class. And what emerges from that amalgamation of people is what they called the Samaritans. They were an ethnic and a religious group all of their own. Because the Samaritans had a historical connection to the people of Israel, a lot of their faith was based on Jewish practices. But then a lot of it wasn't, because they married a bunch of people who weren't Jewish. So they brought with them their own superstitions and their own religious practices. And what they end up with after a few generations of this is a religion where Jesus says, like, you don't even know what you worship. Like, at least the Jews know what we worship. Because they had this historical basis in Israel under the laws of Moses, they go on to combine with these other people, these other religious groups, and they don't have a clue what it is they're actually worshiping anymore. Literally, religiously speaking, they were like half-breeds. So the Jews considered them to be even lower than the Gentiles. Like, you had Jew and Gentile, right? Those are the two categories of people. You either were Jewish or you weren't. And if you weren't, that's the word for that was Gentile. But they had a word all of their own for the people who were like subhuman to them. And that was Samaritan. So when Jesus tells the story of a good Samaritan, you can see where it was so controversial. They hated the Samaritans and deep hatred with them. The Samaritans had built their own temple to Yahweh, right? To the God of Israel on Mount Gerizim. But the Jews burned it down in 128 BC. Obviously, that made tensions even more sketchy, right? It got kind of squirrely there several centuries. And it made the relationship between the Jews and the Samaritans even worse. Now, you would have pious Jews, these Jews who insisted on observing every single religious law that, it's kind of like we have today, right? You've got your like uber churchy people who get weird about it. And then you've got people who are like, yeah, I go to church, but I'm also a normal person at the same time. Like, my faith and who I am are one, not I act like a fake version of myself in church, and therefore I carry that fake version of myself outside of church because you never know who's watching. Somebody might see us, and they're going to talk about us. That's not why you should be doing that. God's watching all the time, no matter where you're at. So if you're worried about the opinions of men, you're not getting the point. So these pious Jews refused to go anywhere near such a race of people as the Samaritans. But Jews who were not so strict would go through Samaria. Jesus had to go through Samaria. That's what it says. So he didn't consider himself such a strict, pious Jew as the Pharisees. Now, the disciples obviously had no problem talking to him, right? They were buying food. So for commercial purposes, they would deal with the Samaritans, right? You got to do what you got to do to survive. Understand that. And that only came out of necessity, though, because, after all, this crazy homeless rabbi you're following around insists that he has to go through Samaria. He won't go around it like a normal Jew. He's got to go through it. So fine, we'll go buy some food in Samaria. Now, this account is recorded taking place at about noon, right, during the heat of the day. This is why people think that she must have been some kind of disgraced woman. Trying to avoid public eye. Why else would you go during the heat of the day and not in the cool of the morning? Maybe that's when it was easiest for her to go. Skip the lines. Go during the heat of the day because the heat doesn't bother me. I'll go during the middle of the day. It's a nice afternoon stroll. We can't assume we know her reasons for going during the heat of the day. And when we do that, and we preach it from the pulpit that she was a disgraced backwoods woman of bad reputation, sleeping around, we miss the point entirely. Notice her language here, right? In verse 11, she's not afraid to call out the obvious. Sir, the woman said, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. She obviously isn't afraid to speak her mind. That sounds like a bunch of country girls I know too. Married to one of them. So let's recap and summarize the events in John chapter 4 up to this point. Jesus goes into Samaria and sits on a well. Jacob's well. Jacob's well. This is important. It's Jacob's well. We're told that in verse 6. 2. This woman goes during the heat of the day to draw water from Jacob's well. 3. Jesus asks her for the water. 4. She points out this obvious violation in protocol that Jesus, a man, is speaking to her, a non-Jewish woman. And 5. Jesus says he can give her water. She'll never thirst again. Okay. This 6th point is where it gets interesting. Verse 9 says, the Samaritan woman said to him, you are a Jew and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Jesus answered her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. Sir, the woman said, you have nothing to draw with and this well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his livestock? So number 1, you've got nothing to draw this water with, sir. Number 2, this well is deep. And number 3, are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well? So Jacob gave us this well. Okay. Interesting. You track this back. You read the life of Jacob, all the way back in Genesis. Nowhere is it talk about him digging a well. Obviously, he would have had to, right? You have to dig to survive. You got to dig, find water in order to survive. But nowhere does it mention it. This is literally the only place in the Bible that it talks about Jacob's well. You won't find anything else ever, anywhere, talking about Jacob and a well. At all. But apparently, he dug a well and passed it down to his generation after generation after generation. 41 generations. She was right when she said this well runs deep. 41 generations deep. Why did Jesus tell her to go bring her husband back if she wanted to receive the living water? And you'll hear people say, oh, well, Jesus wanted her to admit to her sin. Go bring your husband back. Oh, you don't have one. That's right, because you're sleeping around. You're having an affair right now. Ha, ha, ha. See, you floozy. That's not what that's not what that's about at all. A lot of people will go on and say, oh, it's so that she would know that he's the Messiah, because how else could he know that? And, okay, true, sure. That serves that point. He could have said anything and gotten the same effect. He could have told her what she did when she was 12 and gotten the same effect. That's not what he did. I believe what she said when she said this well runs deep. So let's talk about Jacob and his well. Go way back, Genesis, way back. What can you recall about Abraham? So we're going 43 generations back. Think about Abraham. How about in Genesis chapter 12 when he lied about his wife? Right? His wife Sarai. He lied about his relationship with her because she's pretty and you just tell them that you're my sister. Otherwise, they'll kill me and take you for themselves. So you're my sister, not my wife. And he basically gives his wife over to Pharaoh. out of fear. Yep, that's not my wife. That's my sister. You can have her. Abandons her. Rejects her as his wife. Rejects her from the position of a husband. Like, denies her. And then years later, Abraham went right back to this lie. He didn't just do it once. Homeboy had a habit of doing this, okay? He went right back to it when him and Sarah traveled through Gerar, right? Genesis chapter 20. And again, he was afraid they were going to kill him and take her, so he just lied and said, she's my sister. And when the Philistine king, Abimelech, discovered Abraham's deception, he rebuked Abraham for exposing others to the risk of adultery through his lies. So, I wouldn't want to be Sarah, right? You're just constantly being rejected by the guy who's supposed to be looking out for you. And then, so let's fast forward. Okay, fast forward to Abraham's son, Isaac. What can you remember about Isaac? How about when he lied about the identity of his wife Rebekah when in Gerar 2? And for the same reason, and to the same king. The king's got to be like, what's wrong with this family? Like, how many times are they going to do this? Like, oh, this is a beautiful woman, you can have her. And like, find out that's your freaking wife, dude. What's wrong with you? And then your son does the exact same thing years later? What are you thinking? Same sin, same lie, same rejection, same abandonment. A husband is supposed to protect his wife. He's supposed to choose his wife above all others. Ephesians chapter 5. This is the one that gets a lot of heat because it's preached incorrectly and people don't understand what the word submit means. And wives, submit to your husbands. I won't submit to my husband. Okay. It's supposed to be submit under the leadership of, right? So in this case, Sarah submitted to Abraham's leadership and followed him. And then he abandoned his post, rejected her, and violated that trust. He didn't do the job of a husband because Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25 says, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Out of fear and self-preservation, Abraham gave up his wife to save himself. He abandoned her. Apparently, Abraham never got the message of what a husband's supposed to be. So in turn, his son, Isaac, never learned that lesson either. So what about Isaac's son, Jacob? You know, one who got named Israel because he wrestles with God all night. Before he wrestles with God and gets the name Israel, right? Israel fights with God. His name was Jacob, which means he cheats, he deceives, he lies. What did Jacob do? Literally conned his way into his brother Esau's birthright, right? Cheated him out of it. So decades later, Jacob's sons will go on to lie about the welfare of one of his sons, right? Their brother, Joseph. You know, the coat of many colors? They'll go on and lie about what happened to him, bring him back a coat soaked in goat's blood, convincing him that his son was eaten by animals. They reject and abandon their post of a brother. Reject and abandon Joseph. Jacob passed this behavior right on down to his sons. So why does Jesus make this sudden abrupt turn in the conversation about living water to go bring your husband? Look at it again. Verse 13, Jesus answered, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, The water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and keep coming here to draw water." He told her, "Go call your husband and come back." "Well, I have no husband," she replied. Jesus said to her, "You're right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you've had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband." What you have just said is quite true. The man you have now... So we focus on the wrong point of this when we're reading this. And everybody always focuses on your husband. The one you have now is not your husband. It's somebody else's husband. That's how we interpret it. When I was reading this, I read it differently. You've had 5 husbands, and the one you're with now is not your husband. He's not doing his job. He's not fulfilling his duty as a husband to protect and care for you, to choose you above all others, including himself. So this is where we get that this woman was some kind of immoral, promiscuous, backwoods, uneducated tramp. That's where this comes from. It's where we focus on looking at it, how we look at the words that are laid out on the page. Notice that Jesus praises her for her honesty twice. You are right in that you have no husband. You've had 5, and the man you're living with now is not your husband. He praises her for her honesty. And we take it like, look at her, she's been married 5 times. Man she's with now, not even her husband. She's having some kind of an affair with the 6th guy. Like, how many men you got to go through there, woman? Because we never get her name. But numbers tend to mean things in the Bible when you're going through. You've had 5 husbands. The one you're with now, this 6th guy, he's not even your husband. And then Jesus shows up as the 7th man in her life. And if you've studied anything about numbers in the Bible, how many days of creation? 7 days, right? 6 days, and then 7th day you rested. But creation week is 7 days. A week is 7 days. 7's always indicating the number of completion. He shows up to be the 7th man in her life to finally complete what all these other men failed to do. To look after her, to protect her, to care for her in a way that they never could. So we assume this woman has some kind of bad reputation in this town, which makes no sense at all if you actually read the chapter. Because we forget that at the time, culture matters. And this is why I say, if you don't understand the culture, you don't understand the Bible. The culture at the time is everything. We forget that a woman couldn't issue a writ of divorcement to a man under any circumstance, legally. Nearly every circumstance, anyway. It was very rare to even... Okay, the best case scenario, if a woman wanted to get divorced, she would have to go to the courts and then convince the courts to take her case to the husband, and then the courts would have to try to convince the husband to issue a writ of divorcement. But they couldn't force it. Women were considered property. So you've had 5 husbands, and we make it sound like she's just like marrying them and leaving them, and she couldn't do that. So obviously that's not the case. What that means is we get either two options. Either they have all died off, and if that's the case, I have more questions. I doubt that's the case. Or these men have put her away, issued a writ of divorcement, a bill of divorcement to this woman each time. They have abandoned her. They have rejected her as a wife 5 times. The one she's with now won't even commit to marry her. That's not her fault. We can't say she's divorced 5 times and that's her fault. That's not her fault. We can't lay blame for the divorce on her feet when she literally could not issue one. I mean, she could have done things, sure, that led to them wanting to divorce. I understand that. That's valid. But even still, it takes two to make a marriage work. It takes two to kill it. And in this case, to officially kill it, it took a man. The woman couldn't. So I think we don't understand the culture, and so we put this all on her. And that wasn't what the point of this chapter, this message, ever was. Jesus calls her attention to this situation, right? He brings her attention to her situation in a way of, go get your husband. This man who should be fulfilling the duty of husband. No, I have no husband. Yeah, no. And that you spoke truly, right? Like, yeah, you're right, you don't. Because he's not doing the job. He calls attention to her situation, basically telling her, like, yeah, you have faced the rejection over and over and over and over and over and over again. You're still thirsty. You're now, and the funny thing is, yeah, that became like a slang term here a couple of years back. No, you thirsty. There's a reason why that term came to mean what it came to mean in a current culture. It meant the same thing even back then, right? Like, you're thirsty. You're now on your sixth man who should be your husband. Even he won't commit to you or you won't commit to him. Could be either one. We can't assume either or from the context. But you're still thirsty. You've tried returning to this well over and over and over and over again and over again and over again. Always coming back to this well that your father Jacob dug. But this water doesn't seem to last. It doesn't seem to sustain you at all for any length of time. You always have to come back here and draw water out of this well. When that thirst hits you again, you'll be back here trying to draw more water, trying to satiate that need for survival that you just can't seem to get. But I'm here to tell you today that, okay, Jesus sat down on the well, and it says, as he was tired from the journey, right? He sat down on the well because he was tired. But that's not why he went to Samaria. I believe he went to Samaria because she was tired. He sat down on the well because he was tired. But he went because of her. He went to become the seventh man in her life, to complete what was broken and to stop the cycle. Verse 7, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" Instead of returning to this well that your father Jacob gave you 41 generations ago, a deep well of constant rejection and abandonment, why don't you give me what you've been carrying and drawing out of this well? Give me a drink. Give it to me. Instead of trying to quench your thirst with a broken well of disappointment and heartache, give it to me. What is stopping us from receiving that refreshing, living water Jesus talks about? The one that kind of gives us a peace and a calming to our soul. What gets in the way? Have we ever thought about it? And you'll hear people say, oh, it's sin. Sin separates you from God. Okay, yes. But why only certain ones? Like, Paul talks about this too, right? And he says, like, there's sins that so easily beset us, right? Sins that entangle you, but won't entangle me. But then I've got my own weaknesses too. But they don't bother you. Do we ever wonder why? Why is it that some of them affect us more than others? Go get your husband. Well, I don't have a husband. You're right. Look at your situation. Go. Find the thing that's hurting you and bring it back to me. That's what Jesus told her. Go get your husband and bring him to me. I don't have one. You're right. Like, you see the issue. Jesus knew she didn't have a husband. And that's how she knew who he was. But Jesus still tells her to go bring your husband to me. You're with a man who's not your husband. Go bring him to me. I feel like this is something that we miss a lot of times too. And like, I've lived this. I know it. The only way for me to truly be a good husband was for me to be brought to Jesus and for Jesus to make me into a better man, a better husband. Without Jesus, my wife wouldn't have a husband. She would have a man that she's living with, but it wouldn't be a husband because I didn't understand what that meant. And the only way for me to understand what that meant was for me to meet Jesus, for me to understand it, for me to have a relationship with him first. Then I could learn how to love my wife the way she's meant to be loved and protected and cared for and provided for. Like Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. So that brings up the question, what wells do you go back to every time you're thirsty? What wells are we going back to every time we experience that pain? What wells do we go back to every day that we don't even realize are the reason why we're still thirsty? Every time we feel the sting of the sins of our fathers going back through the generations, do we even recognize that it's a generational curse? These are generational chains? Jesus showed up and broke down generational chains on this day at the well with the Samaritan woman. And we blow right past that like that's nothing. So yeah, this well runs deep. She was right. Very deep. 41 generations deep. And the question she asks him, like, "Sir, you've got nothing to draw water with. And this well is deep." It was never his intention to draw water out of the broken well. It was his intention to replace the broken well with one that worked. He is that well of living water. Now, you may be sitting here thinking, like, okay, yep, I already know Jesus. This doesn't apply to me. How does this affect me at all? I'm going to point you to Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 13. My people have committed 2 sins. 2. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water. Cisterns, another word for a well. So, my people, right? I know Jesus. Yeah, he says, my people have committed 2 sins. They have forsaken me, and they have dug their own wells, their own cisterns, broken wells, and they can't hold water. Let me ask you a question Jacob probably didn't consider. What wells are you digging for your kids? He probably didn't even think about it. Because we think okay, we are imperfect. I have my own faults. I have my own sins. But not realizing that if I repeatedly go back to those, I'm digging a well. Do you ever hear the phrase, like, you're digging a hole you won't be able to get out of? You're digging a well because you're trying to draw something to sustain you from a hole. And it can never fill a void by digging a hole. What wells are you digging that your kids are going to return back to because they have seen you do it in order to try to feel whole again? Are you having conversations with your kids about the sins that so easily entangle and entrap and ensnare you? That's something we don't do often. They need to know the sins that have plagued their family throughout generations, right? If I had Huntington's disease, I'm going to have a conversation with my kids about looking out for the signs early on, because I know it's an inherited disease. There's no cure for it. The best thing you can hope to do is manage it better sooner. So I'll have conversations like, keep an eye on that slight tremor in your hand. That's how mine started. Keep an eye on the slurred speech and the forgetfulness. Like, that's how mine starts. That's how mine started. But if they don't know what to look out for, the signs and the symptoms, they could be fully into it before they realize what's happening to them. And then it's much more difficult to manage. You know, if I was an addict, I would be having conversations with my kids about the triggers, the context, the scenarios, the things that can lead to being an addict. Because as a man, if I struggle with being addicted to heroin and addicted to cocaine and addicted to whatever, if I struggle with that, I need to have conversations with my kids about, watch for this, be on guard for this. Because yes, gambling may not be your problem, right? You may not like lose your entire life savings and, forsake your family because you have a gambling problem. I never had that problem. My dad never had that problem. His dad never had that problem. But, meth, yeah, that's our problem. Like, we need to have these conversations, open and transparent about them. Now, we need to have these conversations with our kids to tell them, like, that's a well that I dug that I kept going back to, and it didn't fill me. It didn't make me feel whole. It was just a hole. And it leaves you thirsty time and time again. And then you have to keep going back for more and keep going back for more. And you waste energy and resources and time and decades of your life going back for more. And it's only going to leave you thirstier. If I struggle with unhealthy relationships, I'd be having conversations with my kids about the signs to watch out for in their own relationships, right? Putting up barriers and walls and keeping people at arm's length. Building walls to guard myself, which really translates into keeping other people out. Things like self-sabotage and how to manage through these. If I struggle with negativity, I'm going to have a conversation about how to maintain perspective, how to get a different perspective, when to seek counsel, when to seek perspective. Because I struggled with that too. And if I struggled with it, there's a good chance you're going to struggle with it. 2 Peter chapter 2, 14 through 17. Now I'll read this from the King James Version because I love this version of this passage. And you'll see immediately why. Modern translations change it. And I think it should stay exactly the way it is. It's hilarious. 2 Peter 2:14 through 17 says, having eyes full of adultery, and that cannot cease from sin, beguiling unstable souls. A heart they have exercised with covetous practices, cursed children, which have forsaken the right way, and gone astray, following the way of Balaam, the son of Bosor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness, but was rebuked for his iniquity. The dumbass, speaking with man's voice, forbade the madness of the prophet. Dumbass. It's hilarious. It's not what it means, but literally it means this mute donkey, right? And that's how they basically translate it now. It's like this mute donkey couldn't speak, spoke with man's voice, right, to rebuke the madness of the prophet. Verse 17 is the point I want to look at, though. All of that, the adultery, sin, beguiling unstable souls, right? In other words, like taking advantage of people who are unstable in those moments of vulnerability. Cursed children, forsaking the right way, following the wrong way. Verse 17, these are wells without water, clouds that are carried with a tempest, to whom the mist of darkness is reserved forever. Wells without water. We all have sins that easily trap us. We need to recognize what they are. They're wells without water. They're broken wells. They can't hold water. Sins that we drink up like water. according to Job 15:16, which says, "How much less mortals who are vile and corrupt, who drink up evil like water." But Isaiah tells us what the cure is to all of this, because at this point you go, okay, well, yes, this is true. We all suffer with whatever, but what do I do about it? Isaiah gives us the answer in chapter 12, verse 3. It says, "With joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation." So, yeah, maybe you're tired, right? Maybe it's the kind of tired you just can't sleep off. Maybe you're at a point where, like this woman, right? Jesus asked this woman to give him the water she had been drawing out. Let him replace it with something that works. To treat the disease, not just the symptoms. Maybe you're frustrated. Maybe you're stressed. Maybe you're anxious. All of this is not what your life is meant to be. You don't know why you keep circling back to the same unhealthy habits, the same sins, the same temptations. These wells that are broken and they don't sustain you for very long. So stop drawing out of that well. Give it to Jesus. And you'll notice, in order for this woman's life to change, do you notice what immediately happens? We skip this part too. It's right here in verse 28. It says that she had to leave her water jar, right? She dropped her water jar. The thing that she was using to carry the water that she drew out of this well that Jacob had dug. She had to drop it. And she went and ran off to tell the people of the town about, this man that told her everything she'd ever done. She leaves him at Jesus' feet, drops him. So not only giving him the water, but the means by which she was drawing it, she leaves at his feet. So you might be thinking that, okay, yeah, sure, whatever. This still doesn't seem like it applies to me. Okay, fair enough. Maybe you're thinking that you already have grown beyond these kinds of issues. And if so, man, props. If we could all be so righteous. This is one of the longest dialogues ever recorded between Jesus and any individual. It violated every protocol of the day. The disciples took notice of it. Although they dare not ask, why he was talking to her. The King James says that they marveled at it. So look at verse 35 real quick. Back in John 4. When Jesus said, "Don't you have a saying, it's still 4 months until harvest? I tell you, open your eyes and look at the fields, they're ripe for harvest. Even now, the one who reaps has a wage," right? We read this earlier. So skip down verse 39. Many of the Samaritans from the town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. This is how I know she wasn't that kind of woman of bad reputation. She obviously knew enough of politics of the day to hold a conversation about it. She obviously knew enough of the social protocol of the day to have a conversation about it. She couldn't have been of bad reputation or nobody in the town would have listened or believed her. Context matters, people. And down in verse 42, they said to the woman, "We no longer believe just because of what you said." We believed because of what you said. So obviously she was a woman of good reputation. Now we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this man really is the Savior of the world. They didn't understand why he would speak to that kind of woman, his disciples. Why would Jesus, a good Jew, after all, break rank and speak to a Samaritan? We don't like her kind. We don't talk to them. We have no dealings with them. What are you doing? Jesus, this is not okay. This is not normal. They saw nothing in Samaria except a means to an end. Somewhere to buy food and take the mission back home. Jesus saw a field ripe for harvest. So whose eyes are you looking through? Are you seeing others the way that Jesus does? Or are you seeing a part of town that you try to avoid simply to take the mission back home? We don't deal with them. We don't deal with those people. Let me ask you this. Who evangelized Samaria? Was it the disciples? After all, that was their job. Or was it the Samaritan woman, who they didn't even want to talk to, let alone go through Samaria? I think we forget a lot of the Bible for the sake of comfort and convenience. We forget that the very first time anyone in the Old Testament spoke to the angel of the Lord, Jesus, before he was Jesus, right? Before he came born as a human in the form of Jesus. The angel of the Lord is representing Jesus Christ before his birth. Because we've got to remember, Jesus wasn't just born and that's when he came into existence. He was there in the beginning, right? So the angel of the Lord, the first person that ever spoke to him, the first time we see angel of the Lord called out in Scripture, is in Genesis 16. And it's when he shows up to this rejected, abandoned, neglected woman at a well in Genesis 16. And her name was Hagar. And God called her by her name. Even Abraham and Sarah didn't give her that dignity. They just kept calling her maid, slave girl, Egyptian. Look at Genesis 16, verse 7 through 8. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was a spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from? Where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai, she answered. And then if you skip down to verse 13, after he has this conversation with her, she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. She called him El Roi, the God who sees me. She was rejected and despised by those that were closest to her. And then Jesus shows up by a well. And she gave him a name. Indeed, she's the only person in all of Scripture who names God to his face. Right? Like, not after the fact. After he's like left the scene and then gives him a name, right? Nope. She names him El Roi, the God who sees me. We can't underestimate how extraordinary that is. Like, if you look at Jacob, he named the spot where he wrestled with God all night by the river, right? He named it Peniel, the face of God, Genesis 32:30. And after coming so close to sacrificing Isaac, Abraham named the place Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will provide. But again, he named the place. Elsewhere, Abraham calls upon the name of God, but that's like a different thing altogether, right? That's not naming God. That's not giving him a name. Hagar does not name God as like an aside, right? It's not like after the fact. It's literally in the moment. She calls him El Roi. You are the God who sees me. You may feel rejected. You may feel despised, abandoned, neglected by those that are closest to you, those meant to protect and care for you. He sees you. You might be dealing with the neglect of a father or a husband who should have been there for you. He sees you. You may be struggling with a deep well of anger that goes back generations, and you never even realized it didn't start with you. He sees you. You may be breaking relationships and self-sabotaging because you've never experienced a love that didn't hurt. So the only way you know to deal with it is to lash out in anger and hatred and vitriol in order to make it stop before it gets to a point where they can hurt you. Because you don't know how to stop drinking from that well. He sees you. Give that to him. Let him replace it with water that works. You can't keep drinking from a broken well. The water's toxic. So leave the water jar at Jesus' feet. Because he sees you. He truly knows you. And he came through generations of pain just for the chance to speak with you. Let him break the generational chains that you have been carrying so long that leave you so exhausted, feeling so depleted and run down all the time. Jesus said in verse 10, if you knew the gift of God, it's a gift. It's a free gift. And who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. You were never meant to carry those burdens. You were never meant to carry that pain. You were never meant to bear the scars all on your own. You weren't designed for it. That's literally why Jesus went to the cross. For you. Because he sees you. Leave your pain at his feet. Drop the jars. Stop digging out of those wells. Ask him for water that replaces it and fills the void so that you don't thirst again. So that you can go and tell others about a God who sees me. I love you guys. I'll catch you next week. Thanks for joining.